we're going to review compare objects. And this function is actually really interesting. It's one of my favorite concepts because the exercise asks us to write a function that returns true if two objects contain the same data and false if they don't. Well, aren't we just asking if one object equals another? Can't we just use the double or triple equal signs to see if those work? You might have tried that with this problem, and you might have also seen that it didn't work. Before we start, I want to explore a little bit why that's the case. So if you direct your eyes to the terminal, I'm going to make an object, and it's just called obj. And that object is empty. I'm going to create another one. It's just going to be object2, and it's also an empty object. You'd think that these objects would be equivalent to each other, but when I test this, they are not. Object 1 does not equal object 2. In fact, object 1 doesn't even loosely equal object 2. And this is an interesting thing because, if I have an empty string, this does equal an empty string. I can have 2 and it equals 2. All of these are true, and we know that. But for objects, it's a little bit different. And this is because objects, whether or not they are equal to each other, doesn't depend on their contents, but rather, are they actually the same object? Obj and obj2 are completely different objects in memory. They have different locations that they are stored in the computer. It's almost like if you have identical twins. They have the same genetic material, they look the same, but they are still two different people. They're not the same person. And that's how it works for objects and equality. If I instead, let's clear this, we have more room. If I instead said var object equals an empty object, actually I'm going to put something in there. I'll just say num is 5, 6. And then I say var object2 is equal to object. Now I have object, object2, which holds the same contents. These, let's see if they are equal to each other. They are. So because they reference the same location in memory, they are actually the same object. And this triple equals, strictly equals, is going to give us true. So that means if you are comparing two objects and you want to see if they're equal in the sense that they have the same contents, you have to go about it a bit differently, which is what this function is asking you to do. We need to check the first object and make sure that every property in that object also is in the second object. And then we need to check the second object and make sure all of those properties are in the first object. It's a little bit tedious. There are libraries that often can do it for us, but we're going to create a function that does it by ourselves. Okay, so we know that we're checking through object 1 and we're checking through object 2. This tells me we're going to need 2 loops going through each of the objects. And how do we loop through objects? Well, we can't use a for loop because for loops generally rely on numbers in order to find specific properties. So they work very well for arrays, but not so much for objects. Instead, we're going to use a for in loop. So a for in loop defines a key and uses that key to traverse through the object. So for each key in object 1, we want to do something specific. We want to check to see if that key also exists in object 2 and it needs to have the same value. If it doesn't, well, we can go ahead and return false because it only takes one not matching to tell us that our objects are not equivalent to each other. So I'm going to write an if statement here, and I'm just going to see if these two values at that key are the same or different. So I'm going to say object at key. If it's not equal to the other, to object 2 at key, then we want to return false. It looks like I forgot the 1 here. If I run this, I get false and undefined. And that's exactly what we would expect. We get false because as we go through object 1, the properties in object 2 do not match this name property. Giselle and Zeke don't match, so we return false. We don't get an output of true yet because we're not returning true anywhere, and we'll get to that. This won't work for all use cases though. This doesn't catch all of the times that our objects might be different. Let's make another test case and put it right here. And we'll say that the name for the second is also Giselle, but there's an additional property, and I'll call it last name, perhaps, and we'll just have Brown. So now all of the properties in object 1 can be found in object 2, but object 2 has an additional property. This is going to give us undefined. So we still have one more case to check here. We need an additional for loop that will go through object 2 and check to see if all of those properties can be found in object 1. To make this go a little faster, I'm just going to copy and paste our first for in loop and just change a couple of the variables inside. So that we're not reusing variables that we've already defined, I'll make this key 2, and I want to go through object 2. Change these keys to key 2, and I'll return false if any key doesn't match as I'm going through object 2. So if I run this, I now get both of my falses. Great. So now I just need to figure out when I want to return true. I have two if statements in here. I suppose I could just say else, return true here. But what would be the problem with that? I see a lot of people make this mistake, and it makes sense from a logical point of view that, well, if they don't match, I want to return true. But this is going to return true prematurely, because you're saying if just one of them matches, I want to return true. But we only want to return true if every property from both objects matches. And so we want to return true not at any specific event, but just once we've searched the entire object and we've never returned false. So after we've done both of our for in loops, then we want to return true. And we'll only get to line 14 if there was never a mismatch between the two objects. Let's run it. Those tests look good. Let's run our tests cases here. They all pass.